The archive opens at fourth bell. I know because I am always there before it does. That is the first thing you should understand about my particular corner of the Calethi Palace. It is the one place in the entire compound where a woman with a mop and a bucket and 16 years of accumulated silence can be genuinely invisible. The scholars who come at fifth bell do not see me. The junior catalogers who straggle in at sixth bell with their arms full of data folio stacks do not see me. The two palace librarians, Arith San and old Dorvith Kale, who have occupied the same desks for so long that I think the wood has begun to grow around their elbows, have never once, in 3 years of working alongside them, acknowledged my presence beyond the occasional grunt when I am too thorough in dusting near their inkwells. I do not say this bitterly. Invisibility is a useful condition. I understood that long before I came to mop floors in the Vel Rithani wing. My name is Marit Das. I am 44 years old. I came to the palace cleaning staff through a placement service that handles human workers in the capital district, and my references listed 8 years of domestic service at a mid-tier noble house in the outer ring, which was accurate. What the references did not list, because I had not offered the information and the placement service had not asked, was the 12 years before that. I had worked very hard to make sure those 12 years occupied no official record anywhere in the Calethi system that a palace administrator might stumble across. I was not hiding from anything precisely. I simply did not want to answer questions. I had answered enough questions, in enough field tents and debrief rooms and formal inquiry halls, to last me the remainder of my natural life. So I cleaned. I was good at it. I am meticulous by temperament. My hands, which are broad and scarred in ways that domestic work does not produce, nevertheless move precisely. I do not hurry. I do not rush a thing. I clean an archive shelf the same way I once checked a field dressing, thoroughly, with attention to the things that are easy to miss, because the easy-to-miss things are the ones that cause problems later. A physician I once worked under, a woman named Velith Keth who had been practicing field medicine for longer than I had been alive, told me once that the difference between a competent medic and a good one was not speed or knowledge but patience. The willingness to stay with something until you were certain, rather than moving on because you thought you were probably right. I have thought about that most days since she said it. I think about it every time I run an extension cloth along a high shelf that no one has looked at in 6 months and find, behind the third folio stack, a small mechanical failure in the ventilation baffle that would have cost the palace 12,000 credits to repair if it had been left another winter. The Vel Rithani archive wing occupies the deepest tier of the palace's oldest structure. It is a long room, vaulted at both ends, with shelving carved directly into the stone walls, and a central table of black Rithani wood that has not been moved since the first Calethi emperor laid it. The stone it sits on shows the impression of its feet, 4 shallow depressions worn into the floor over 2 centuries of unchanged weight. The light comes from overhead panels that approximate natural Calethi dawn spectrum, warm and low in the mornings, building to a comfortable reading brightness by midday. The floor is deep gray stone, cold to the knees in winter, merely cool in the long palace summers. I have kneeled on it a great deal. You notice the temperature of a floor when you kneel on it every day. There are certain smells that define a room invisibly but completely. The Vel Rithani archive smells of old folio binding, pressed fiber, and the preservation oil the Althari use on important documents, which has a faint medicinal undertone I find soothing. In cold months it also smells of stone, and the particular damp of old stone against a poorly insulated exterior wall. I have learned to find that smell comfortable too, the way you learn to find comfortable any smell that has become synonymous with a place you are glad to be. I had been cleaning the archive for 11 months before the new cataloging assistant arrived. He came quietly, which was the first thing I noticed. Most junior palace workers arrive with the particular nervous energy of someone trying too hard to seem capable. They talk to themselves, they drop things, They ask librarian Arith San questions whose answers are obvious to anyone who has spent 5 minutes in the room. This one did not. He arrived at fifth bell on a Rithani month Tuesday carrying a light canvas bag, not a datafolio stack, and he sat down at the far end of the long table and looked at the room for a long moment before he opened anything. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way that suggested frame rather than bulk. His hair was the pale silver white that marks certain Althari bloodlines, cut close and undecorated, without the ornamental braiding that Kortrank Althari often wear even in working dress. His clothes were plainly made, the gray workrobe of a mid-rank palace assistant, nothing to mark him out. His hands, when he finally set them flat on the table and looked at the first folio, were fine-boned and unhurried. I noticed all of this the way I notice everything. Then I went back to the shelf I was working on and said nothing. He was there again the next morning, and the next. His name, per the register that Arith San maintained, was Vel Soren. An unremarkable name in the Althari palace structure. Vel is a prefix attached to dozens of house and rank combinations, and Soren is common enough that you hear it several times in any administrative corridor. He was listed as a second-grade cataloging assistant, assigned to the Rithani primary sequence, which is a legitimately dull task. The Rithani primary sequence covers 300 years of pre-imperial administrative records that nobody has looked at since the scholar who cataloged them died, also 300 years ago. It is exactly the kind of work that a junior assistant would be given. It is also exactly the kind of work that requires no particular credentials to perform, that no senior official would ask about, and that keeps a person occupied and unobtrusive for weeks at a stretch. I understood, in the way I understand most things quietly and without comment, that there was something wrong about him by the end of the second week. It was not his manner. His manner was impeccable. He was courteous to Arith San, deferential to old Dorvith Kale, and entirely invisible to the rest of the archive staff in the way that competent low-rank workers learn to be. He worked steadily. He did not fidget. He did not talk beyond what courtesy required. He brought his own food from somewhere outside the palace and ate it at the far end of the table during the midday quiet period, unhurried, in the particular self-contained way of someone accustomed to eating alone and comfortable with it. He always had a single cup of what I eventually identified as Sorvith bark tea, a pale, slightly bitter infusion that most humans find unpleasant, but that certain Althari lineages drink as a respiratory support, particularly at altitude or in close indoor air. Sorvith bark tea. I filed that away without knowing quite why. By the third week, I had noticed 3 other things. His breathing was always slightly audible at the start of the morning, particularly on cold days, when he would take 3 or 4 careful breaths before settling into his rhythm. Not dramatic, not distressing, simply the considered breathing of someone who has developed a personal protocol around something that requires one. He pressed his left hand flat against his sternum sometimes when he thought no one was watching. Not in distress, exactly, but the automatic pressure of a person managing something minor and chronic, the body memory of a technique applied so many times it no longer requires conscious intention. And once, during the third week, when he leaned forward quickly to catch a folio that had started to slide from the stack he was working through, he made a sound, just a sound, barely audible, a catch in the chest rather than anything louder that I knew. I had heard that sound in a lot of places. A field tent at Velith Station, on the second morning of the Kale Line engagement, when a young soldier with a chest compression had tried to sit up too fast, and his rib cage had done exactly what a compressed rib cage does when it is asked to do more than it can. A triage corridor on the San Line, in winter, when the cold had moved through the canvas walls of the forward station, and done what cold does to soft tissue under pressure. A medevac transport on the Kale Reach approach, in the gray pre-dawn of an extraction, when a patient I thought was stabilized had demonstrated that stabilized and recovered, are two very different things. I knew what that sound meant about the mechanics of a chest. I knew about the particular kind of pressure differential that makes a rib cage catch instead of expand on the inhalation, about the structures involved, about the conditions under which that catch stays minor and the conditions under which it does not. This knowledge is not the kind you can unknow. It becomes part of the way you hear certain sounds, the way certain sounds become immediate and specific rather than vague and general. And from that point on you cannot choose not to understand what you have heard. I did not say anything about any of this to anyone. This is the part that people find hardest to understand when I try to explain it later, in the formal inquiry and the informal ones. Why did I say nothing? I had noticed something significant. A reasonable person, they say, would have alerted someone. A medical professional, even a former one, even one who has been carrying a mop for 3 years, surely has some obligation that doesn't simply evaporate because she has stopped being officially a medical professional. The answer is complicated, and I gave the short version at the inquiry because the long version requires explaining things about myself that I was not prepared to explain in a formal setting. The short version is, I was not certain. A catch in the breath, a habit of breathing carefully, a preference for sorveth bark tea, these are data points, not a diagnosis. Dozens of conditions, most of them entirely manageable and most of them not my business, produce exactly those signs. The man was upright, functional, working competently every day, apparently fully capable of managing his own life. He had presumably been managing his own chest for his entire adult life without my intervention. I was a palace maid. Informing a senior official that a cataloging assistant breathed in a way I found medically interesting was not within the scope of what a palace maid does. I had no standing, no credentials, no legitimate reason for anyone to take my observation seriously, and no way to explain the source of my certainty without opening conversations I had specifically arranged my life to avoid. And beneath all of that, if I am being fully honest, which I have found at 44 is the only sustainable approach to one's own history, there was something else. I recognized him in the way that you recognize a person who has learned to manage quietly, to be unobtrusive about something they carry, to develop the private protocols that let them function at full capacity in a world that does not know what they are managing and would react poorly if it did. I had spent 12 years doing exactly that. Not about the same thing, not in the same way, but the structure of it was familiar. The careful morning routine, the particular self-containment of someone who has accepted a set of limits and found a way to live well within them. I understood the choice he was making, because I was making a version of it myself. So I watched, and I said nothing, and I cleaned. And every morning I made sure that the archive's ventilation conduit was fully open, because the Vel Rithani wing's air handling is 40 years old and runs cold and close on winter mornings. And close cold air is the particular enemy of the condition I thought I might be looking at. I also, quietly and without announcement, began spending more time near the eastern ventilation access panel during the first winter, noting that the baffle needed adjustment every 3 to 4 weeks to keep airflow adequate. I adjusted it accordingly, without filing a maintenance ticket, because a formal ticket would have triggered an official inspection, a determination that the entire air handling system needed replacement, and weeks of construction during which the archive would have been unusable. The adjustment took 4 minutes per visit. I added it to my rotation without comment. 3 years. I know that seems like a long time to watch something and say nothing. He came and went. There were weeks in the first year when he did not appear, and then he would return, always quietly, always in the same gray work robe, always with his canvas bag and his sorveth bark tea. In the second year he came more consistently 4, sometimes 5 mornings a week. He made slow, genuine progress on the Rithani primary sequence, which surprised me. I had expected the project to be cover for something else, a reason to be in the room rather than actual work, but he was methodical and thorough, cross-referencing related sections, building an internal index that the existing catalog lacked, filling in the gaps in the chronological record that 3 centuries of inconsistent archival practice had created. After 18 months, he had organized more of that 300-year administrative archive than the previous cataloging assistant had managed in 4 years. Old Dorvath Kale actually mentioned it to Arath San one afternoon, in the low murmur the two of them used when they thought they were being inaudible, the murmur that in fact carries perfectly well to anyone working within 6 meters of their desks. He said Vel Soren had a good eye for structural indexing, and more surprisingly, that he seemed to be genuinely interested in the material, which Dorvath Kale found unusual and apparently pleasing in a mid-rank cataloging assistant. In the 3rd year, I began to understand that he came to the archive for the same reason I did. It was quiet there, not the performed quiet of a formal room where silence is a social expectation, and the effort of maintaining it is visible in the careful way people move and speak. It was the deep, genuine quiet of a place where the walls are stone, and the work is slow, and no one is watching you perform anything, because the work itself is the performance and the audience for that particular performance, the administrative records of 3 centuries, waiting with infinite patience to be organized, neither notices nor cares about anything beyond the quality of the attention given to it. In the rest of the palace, I knew this from the other cleaning staff, from the fragments of information that move through service corridors the way water moves through stone, slowly but eventually everywhere. There is always an audience. There is always a requirement to be the thing you are supposed to be, to stand correctly, to compose your face correctly, to exist at the correct level of formality for whoever might be watching. The Vel Rithani archive had no audience. The 2 librarians were too absorbed in their own particular work to attend to anyone else's. The junior archivists who occasionally came to pull folios for other departments were in and out in minutes, focused entirely on finding what they needed and leaving. The archive was, in the particular vocabulary of the Kalethi Palace, a backwater, a room at the end of a corridor that few administrators had reason to visit, staffed by 2 librarians of such established seniority that they no longer needed to perform competence for anyone, handling records of an era too distant to have current political relevance. For both of us, it seems, that was precisely the point. I had been thinking about speaking to him, not about his breathing, not about any of the things I had noticed, but simply about acknowledging that we had occupied the same room for 3 years without exchanging a word beyond the necessary minimum, which was a particular kind of absurdity that I had begun to find, in some oblique way, funny, when the morning came that changed everything. It was a Velmonth Thursday, the deep part of the palace winter, when the old archive wing drops to its coldest, and the ventilation runs its most sluggish. I had been there since 3rd bell, which is before any natural light enters the panels and before any staff arrives, running through the high shelving with an extension cloth and working my way methodically down toward the floor. The extension cloth on the high shelves picks up a particular kind of fine gray particulate that has something to do with the stone's composition and the way it interacts with the cold, dry winter air, and I had been working through it for about an hour, moving shelf by shelf, when I heard the door. He arrived at 4th bell, not 5th. I heard the door and then his footsteps, and they were quieter than usual, not because he was trying to be quiet, but because his pace was slower than it normally was, and slower footsteps produce a quieter sound, and I knew from the rhythm of them that something was wrong before I had turned around to look. The word I would use later, in formal contexts, was effortful. He was crossing the room toward his usual seat at the far end of the long table, and each step was considered in the way that steps should not need to be considered in a healthy person. The consideration of someone who is allocating more attention than usual to a task that ought to be automatic, because the automatic systems are not performing at their usual level, and the shortfall is being covered by conscious effort. He had his hand pressed against his sternum, Not the automatic habit pressure I had seen 100 times over 3 years, the body memory of a management technique, but genuine, engaged, deliberate pressure, like someone applying a manual assist to something that was not assisting itself adequately. His lips had the faint blue-gray cast that I know from trauma medicine and from memory, and from the particular quality of light in too many field stations at too many cold dawns. I put the extension cloth down on the shelf. He reached his chair and sat carefully, lowering himself with the controlled caution of someone who is uncertain whether the act of sitting will disturb the balance they are maintaining, and then sat very still. His chest moved again. I watched the third attempt at a full inhalation not complete the way an inhalation is supposed to complete, and that was the end of my 3 years of saying nothing. "Don't move," I said. He looked at me. He had looked at me perhaps 4 times in 3 years, brief, polite acknowledgments of the presence of another person in the room, the standard attention that well-mannered individuals extend to service staff before returning to their own concerns. This look was different. His eyes were focused and clear and very dark, and there was something in them that I can only describe as relieved surprise. As though he had been sitting in this room for 3 years alongside a person he had been wondering about quietly, without knowing quite what he was wondering, and something had just clarified. "I'm familiar with the condition," I said, and left it at that for the moment. I did not call for the palace medical staff. This is the second thing people find difficult to understand. I had a clear emergency protocol available to me. The service corridor call panel was 12 meters away, positioned at the junction of the main corridor and the archive access hall, and it would have connected me in under 30 seconds to the palace medical station, and I did not use it. The truth is that I had about 4 minutes in which to understand what I was working with before adding other people to the situation would become more useful than managing it alone. Not because the condition was immediately fatal. It was not, or was not yet, but because a call panel summons brings people who have been told to move quickly, and people moving quickly in a room where someone is managing a breathing crisis introduce variables that a careful assessment cannot afford. The best thing I could do in the first 4 minutes was reduce the variables, not add them. The Vel-Rithani Archives ventilation conduit access panel is behind the third shelf on the eastern wall, at approximately knee height. I had been cleaning around it for 3 years. I knew exactly what was on the other side of it. A flexible maintenance tube, 40 centimeters of standard gauge pressure line that I had checked and rechecked every winter, a port coupling, and a manual air displacement valve with a functional range. I had tested informally on the 3 occasions when the baffle adjustment required me to open the system, none of which are medical equipment in any official sense. All of which are things I have used as functional equivalents of medical equipment, in circumstances considerably less controlled than the Vel-Rithani archive. I said, "There's a ventilation access panel behind the eastern shelf. I'm going to open it. I need to move one of your chairs closer to the eastern wall. Can you stand for 30 seconds? He could, barely. He stood with the careful deliberateness of someone who has assessed the cost-benefit of the request and concluded that compliance is less dangerous than argument. And I moved the chair and he sat again, and I crossed to the eastern wall and opened the panel with the flat blade multi-tool I keep in my apron pocket. The one piece of equipment I carry that is, strictly speaking, not standard cleaning issue, and which I have never mentioned in any service log, and which I have used for 11 different purposes in 3 years, of which ventilation baffle adjustment is the most frequent, and this is the most consequential. The maintenance tube was where it always was. I uncoiled 40 centimeters of it and detached the port coupling from the wall fitting with 2 turns of the coupling collar. My cleaning cloth, the heavy daily use one, not the extension cloth I had been using on the high shelves, I folded into an 8-layer pad, approximately 20 centimeters square, dense enough to maintain consistent pressure and rigid enough not to collapse under it. I said, This is going to feel strange. It is not going to hurt. I need you to hold this pad against your left side under your arm with steady pressure. Don't clench, just hold. The way you would hold a book against your ribs if you were carrying it with one arm. He looked at the cloth and the tube and at my hands and at my face, and he said nothing for a moment. And then he took the folded cloth and placed it where I indicated with the quiet compliance of someone who has been in enough situations that have gone sideways to know that the time to stop arguing with the person who knows what they are doing is immediately. The tube end I held to the base of his throat, not intrusive, not inserted anywhere, simply positioned at the exterior of the throat at the point where the soft tissue is closest to the surface, in order to exploit the resonance differential that a pressure tube creates against soft tissue when held in contact with it, which alters the mechanical pressure environment at the point where his breathing was catching, and gives the affected structures a few millimeters of additional working room. It is a field trick so old that nobody I have ever spoken to knows where it originally came from. I learned it from a Son-line medic named Vethavar Kale, who had learned it from a field surgeon at the Orth campaign, who had presumably learned it from someone else. And it has been passed down through combat medicine, the way useful things are passed down, informally, from hands to hands, without documentation, without credit, surviving because it works rather than because anyone with authority has certified it. It works. It does not fix anything. It changes the environment in which the affected structures are operating and buys the time needed for proper intervention. In field conditions, that has been enough. In a warm stone archive with a call panel 12 meters away, it was more than enough. His breathing opened. Not fully, the catch was still present, the structural issue unchanged. But the blue-gray cast at his lips began to ease within 2 minutes, progressing from the flat blue-gray of restricted circulation toward the warmer undertone of tissue receiving adequate supply. His hand, which had been pressing the folded cloth against his side with white-knuckled and slightly desperate determination, relaxed by degrees into something that was simply holding. His eyes stayed on my face throughout. I was aware of it the way you are aware of things when your attention is occupied, peripherally, logged without analysis. I said, keep the pressure even, don't let it drift. I'm going to the call panel now. He said, wait. His voice was low and steady. Not a command, he didn't have the breath for commands just then, and in any case I would not have obeyed one if he had. But there was something in the word that made me stop rather than continue toward the corridor. Not fear, not the urgency of someone trying to prevent something. The same quality as the look he had given me when I first spoke, that relieved surprise, that quality of being seen deeper now and more considered. He said, how do you know this? Doesn't matter right now, I said. It matters to me, he said. I looked at him for a moment. He was managing, the rig was doing what it needed to do, his color was continuing to improve, and I had another 2 or 3 minutes before the calculus of waiting versus calling shifted decisively toward calling. I had 2 or 3 minutes to decide whether this was a question I would answer, and under what terms and what I would say. I said I was a field medic before this. He looked at the cloth, and at the tube, and at my hands, and then at my left forearm, which I had not until that moment noticed was fully visible. My sleeve had ridden up past the elbow during the work at the ventilation panel. The coupling detachment requires a particular wrist rotation that catches on loose cuffs and pulls them back, and the mark was there in full view. The brand scar of the Velith front medical corps, a double arc pressed into the skin at the inner forearm by the field certification process that the Althari military used until 12 years ago, when they moved to internal biometric certification. It is not a tattoo, which can be covered or altered or removed by anyone with sufficient reason and sufficient patience. It is a scar made by heat, and it is distinctive, and to anyone who has studied Althari military history in any detail, it is unmistakably the mark of a specific corps, a specific campaign, and a specific period. His eyes went to it and stayed there for a long moment, and his expression shifted in a way that I could not quite read, though what I thought I saw in it was the particular look of someone encountering a piece of information that reorganizes a larger picture. I pulled my sleeve down. "I'm going to the call panel now." I went. What followed was, on its surface, straightforward. The palace medical officer arrived within 6 minutes, assessed the situation, recognized the improvised rig for what it was, and its effect for what it was. I heard him tell the junior medic who arrived with him that it was a Vell pressure technique, one he had seen described in field surgery texts but not encountered in practice, and began proper treatment. The palace physician, whose name I later learned was Veth Orvath, a quiet, competent man who would not meet my eyes for the first 20 minutes, and then met them too directly for about 5 before finding a middle ground, administered the correct medication, and supervised the transfer to the palace medical tier. The medical officer, whose name was Arith Velith, arrived shortly after the physician and asked me 3 questions in rapid succession. What had I done, in what order, and why had I waited before calling? I answered the first 2 straightforwardly. The third I answered with, "I needed to assess before I acted," which is the kind of answer that medical officers respect because it is what they are trained to think, and because it is also, in this case, precisely true. What I did not know, for the first 40 minutes of all of this, was who was in the chair. I knew something was wrong about the situation from the moment the second official arrived. And then the third. The speed of their arrival and the quality of their urgency was not proportionate to a second-grade cataloging assistant having a respiratory event in a backwater archive wing. And then the 2 men in formal court livery who came through the archive door at a rapid walk, saw the empty chair, looked at me, and then at the eastern wall panel still hanging open, and then at the maintenance tube still coiled on the floor, and spoke to each other in the rapid, low Althari court dialect that I am not supposed to understand but do. Because I spent 4 years on the San line, and you learn a language when it is the one being spoken around your patients in the hours before and after surgery. What they said between themselves in the rapid court dialect was, "She stabilized him." And then, does anyone know who she is? I was sitting on the floor at that point, against the base of the eastern shelving, because my knees had elected to stop cooperating, and I had decided not to argue with them. The adrenaline of the previous half hour was doing what adrenaline does when the immediate requirement for it ends, draining out of your system in the way of a tide going out, and leaving behind an exhaustion so complete and thorough that sitting on cold stone felt not merely acceptable but exactly correct. I had my back against the shelf and my hands folded in my lap, and I was looking at the open ventilation panel and thinking, with the specific focus that sometimes happens in the aftermath of a controlled emergency, that I would need to replace the port coupling before the archive got too cold, because the coupling I had detached was the primary seal for the air handling in the eastern section, and without it, the cold air from the exterior wall would move through the maintenance cavity and into the room. One of the court officials crouched down to my eye level. He was older, gray at the temples, with the composed and practiced restraint of someone who has spent a long career managing crises in formal settings, which is a specific kind of competence that you recognize immediately when you encounter it, because it produces a particular stillness. He looked at me with the expression that officials use when they need specific information and are uncertain of the most effective approach to obtaining it. "What is your name?" he said. "Marit Das," I said. "Cleaning staff, 3rd tier. I've been assigned to this wing for 3 years." "Marit Das," he repeated, in the way of someone recording rather than simply acknowledging. "Can you tell me what you observed and when you first observed it?" I told him. I left nothing out. I am not, when it comes to it, a person who edits a medical account. Whatever else I have learned to be quiet about in the years since I left the service, the habit of precise clinical observation is the one thing that did not leave me, and the habit of reporting observations accurately when asked for them directly is something so deeply established that I would need a reason to override it rather than a reason to comply. I told him about the sorvith bark tea, beginning with when I first identified it, about the breathing pattern on cold air mornings, about the left-hand pressure habit, about the sound I had heard when the folio slid. I told him about the ventilation conduit access and the maintenance tube and the cloth and the field technique and where I had learned it, and from whom, and under what circumstances. He listened with great stillness, and when I finished, he said, "You noticed this in the first weeks." "Yes," I said. "And you said nothing for 3 years." "I was not certain," I said. "I am not a physician. I had no standing to report a medical concern about a palace cataloging assistant based on a breathing pattern and a preference for a particular tea." He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked at the maintenance tube on the floor and the open panel, and at my hands, and at my left forearm, which I was holding deliberately at my side with the sleeve pulled down. He said, "May I?" I held out my arm. He looked at the brand scar for a long time without touching it, without speaking, with the specific attention of a person who is identifying rather than merely seeing. Then he sat back on his heels and looked at me with an expression that I did not have a name for at the time, though I thought about it afterward, and decided that the closest word might be recognition, the particular quality of encountering something you had not expected to find in the place where you found it, and understanding that the place is now changed by the finding. He said, "You served on the Velith front." "Yes." "Under what designation?" 3rd Calethi Advanced Medical Corps, attached to the Orvith Reach Forward Station. I held a field certification in emergency respiratory medicine and blunt trauma triage. He was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet I could hear the low sounds of the medical activity in the corridor beyond the archive door, and the particular way that sounds flatten and soften when they pass through heavy stone. Then he said, "The engagement at Orvith Reach was in Year 17, I said, "I know." He stood up slowly. He said, "I need to make a communication. Please wait here." I had no intention of going anywhere. My knees were still working through their position on the matter. The next 20 minutes were the strangest of my adult life, and I have had some genuinely strange ones. The archive room, which had contained no more than myself, Arith San, and old Dorvith Kale on any given morning for 3 years. The 2 librarians had been escorted out by the second official, with the particular gentle efficiency of someone herding scholars away from something they don't need to witness, now filled in a way it had never filled. 6 palace officials, arriving in pairs. 2 medical officers conferring near the door. The sound of someone speaking in a low, urgent tone into a communication device in the corridor. And 1 additional person, who arrived at the archive door in formal attire that was definitively not the gray workrobe of a cataloging assistant. He was wearing the formal inner-court dress that his rank required, and he looked different in it, not smaller, not diminished, but as though a dimension that had always been present had become visible. He stood in the doorway and looked at the empty chair, the open panel, the coil of tube on the floor, and at me against the eastern shelving with my hands folded in my lap. I had not known. I want to be clear about that, though I am aware that "I had not known" is the kind of statement that people tend to find convenient and therefore suspect. I had known that there was something wrong about Vel Soren, something that did not align with his listed rank and credentials. I had known that his presence in the archive was not entirely accounted for by the Rithani primary sequence, though he had been genuinely working on it. I had not known, or had not let myself know, that the specific wrongness was the wrongness of concealed identity rather than the wrongness of complicated history, which is something I understood from the inside, and therefore tended to extend other people the latitude of. His name, I learned in the next 10 minutes from the official with the gray temples, was not Vel Soren. It was Sareth Vel Kethavar, the second son of Emperor Rithavar San. He had been coming to the Vel Rithani archive in a borrowed work robe for 3 years, 2 to 4 mornings a week, to work on the Rithani primary sequence without a retinue, without the protocol that his rank required in any room he occupied officially, and without the chronic respiratory condition he had been managing since birth being anyone's concern but his own. His condition, Vel Rithani compression syndrome, a pressure differential in the lower lung structure that occurs in a small percentage of certain Althari bloodlines, and is named, I noted with a dull private irony, for the archive wing where we had been sitting together for 3 years, was manageable. Had been managed, apparently, by his own discipline and the Sorvith bark tea and the self-applied sternum pressure and the careful avoidance of closed cold spaces in the deep winter months. The palace physicians had told him at 14 that it was minor, controllable, unlikely to progress into anything that required intervention beyond his current protocols. He had believed them, in the way that people believe what they need to believe in order to live their lives without constant attendance. That morning, he had arrived an hour early because the palace's east residential corridor had had a maintenance failure overnight that closed off the ventilation system in his private rooms, and he had spent an hour in unventilated air before the failure registered in the building management system, and he was notified. By the time he reached the archive, he was already in the early stages of a compression event, the kind that presents as nothing immediately critical until the compounding factors accumulate past a threshold, at which point it becomes critical relatively quickly. The palace physician, Veth Orvath, stated in his formal report that had the improvised rig not been applied when it was, the outcome would have been significantly worse. In the hallway outside the archive later, I heard him tell the official with the gray temples something different. Archive doors in old wings are imperfectly fitted. Stone carries sound, he said. She kept him alive. The archive cleared of officials slowly, the way rooms clear when the crisis has passed, but the significance has not. Eventually, the official with the gray temples organized them out with the practiced efficiency of someone who understands that the hardest part of managing an event is convincing the witnesses their presence is no longer required. I was still on the floor when Sareth Velkethavar came back. He crossed the room to where I was sitting and did something I did not expect. He sat down on the floor beside me, not in the adjacent chair, not at the table. On the floor, against the eastern shelving, at approximately the same elevation as me. We were both quiet for a moment. Outside the door the officials were still moving, but quietly now at a distance, with the professional care of people who have been told to give space, and who are genuinely attempting to do so. He said, Velsorin was my father's librarian's cousin. The name is real. He agreed to be listed. I had wondered about the name, I said. Sorin is common, but Velsorin is an odd construction for a second-grade cataloging assistant. You never said anything about it. It wasn't my business, I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, You've been watching my breathing for 3 years. I've been aware of it, I said. I wasn't watching. Watching implies a level of deliberate attention that I didn't think was warranted. I was aware of it the way you are aware of things that fall within your area of knowledge, automatically as a background process, without active monitoring. And this morning it warranted active monitoring, I said, and then active intervention. He looked at my left arm, at the place where the sleeve covered the brand scar, and then at the open panel, and then at the maintenance tube coiled on the floor. He said, Orvath Reach, year 17, you were at the forward station during the Kale advance. Yes. I was 16 when the campaign records came through, he said. I followed them. I follow most of the field records from that period, from all of the Velith engagements. He paused. The Orvath Reach report described something that I had not seen described anywhere else in the campaign records. The standard medical complement cut off from the main line by a secondary corridor collapse. A single junior field medic maintaining the forward triage station alone for 11 hours until the evacuation route reopened. 0 fatalities at the station, 38 patients. He stopped. I was told the field medic's name in the report, but I was 16 and I did not retain it. I said nothing for a moment. The stone floor was cold through my uniform trousers. Outside, the archive corridor was quieting toward the ordinary stillness of a late winter morning. I said 38 patients. The official report said 41, but it overcounted by 3. 2 of the 3 had been transferred to the main line station before the corridor collapsed. The third was, I stopped. 38. He turned and looked at me directly. The expression on his face in that moment is something I have tried several times since to find the right words for. I have not found them entirely. The closest I can come is this. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying an abstract thing. A report, a set of numbers, an account of something that happened in a place they have never been, to a person they have never met, and has just encountered the person, and found that the person is sitting on the same cold stone floor as them, having just kept them alive with a maintenance tube and a folded cloth. He said, "Why did you leave the service?" "I was ready to," I said. He seemed to understand that this was the full answer I intended to give, because he did not press further. He looked at his hands, which were folded in his lap in a mirror of mine, and we were both quiet for a while. I was aware of the archive around us, the smell of the old folios, the low, warm light of the panels, the specific weight of the quiet that belongs to this room. Then he said, "I want to apologize." I looked at him. "Not for coming here," he said carefully. "I don't regret coming here. This room," he paused. "I think you understand why I came here." "I think I do," I said. "For making it difficult for you. To have noticed what you noticed and not been able to act on it or speak about it, because of what my being here required. Because I was managing something I didn't want the palace to know about. And in doing that, I put you in a position where your own better judgment about what you were observing had no legitimate outlet." I considered this for a moment. "You didn't know what I was observing," I said. "You didn't know I had any basis for the observation beyond normal human concern." "After the first year," he said, "I thought you might. The ventilation panel, every cold morning before I arrived, you always opened it fully." He paused. "I didn't know how you knew to do that specifically, but I thought you knew something." I had not known he had noticed that. I took a moment with it. I said I should have found a way to speak. I made a choice to say nothing, and I made it for my own reasons as much as for yours, and this morning I stopped. I should have found a way. "No," he said, "you found the right way. You were there when it mattered, you knew what to do when it mattered, and you did it. That is not a failure of anything." We were quiet again, and this time the quiet was different. The particular quiet of 2 people who have both said what needed saying and have arrived somewhere on the other side of it, where the silence is not empty but settled. The official with the gray temples, his name, I would learn, was Arith Ven, the second keeper of the imperial household, knocked on the archive door and came in without waiting for an answer. He looked at the 2 of us sitting on the floor and had the discretion not to comment on it. He said to Sarath Vel Kethavar, "The physician recommends monitoring for the remainder of the day. The ventilation failure in the residential corridor has been repaired." Then he looked at me and said, "Marit Das, I would like to speak with you about your service record at your convenience." "There isn't much of a record," I said. "I made certain of that." "There is enough of one," he said. "The Orvith Reach Field certification, and certain," he paused, and I saw him calibrating how much to say in the present company. "There are things noted in internal records that you may not have been aware of." "I'd rather not discuss it today," I said, "if that's acceptable." He looked at me for a moment with the expression of an official who is accustomed to being the least refusable person in most conversations, and who has just encountered someone who is not refusing him from defiance or from ignorance, but from the straightforward fact of having spent the morning on cold stone managing a crisis and not having anything left for protocol. He said, "Of course, I will send a formal inquiry in a few days. You are under no obligation to respond until you are ready." "Thank you," I said. He left. Sareth Velkethavar stood up with the careful deliberateness of a person following physician's instructions and offered me his hand. I took it and stood. We were the same height, which struck me as somehow absurd, and I came close to saying so but did not. He said, "Is there anything you need?" I looked at the open ventilation panel, and at the maintenance tube on the floor, and at the port coupling sitting beside it. I said, "I need to reassemble the panel before the room drops below useful temperature. The coupling needs to be reseated or the air handling in the eastern section will be inadequate for the rest of the winter." He looked at the panel for a moment, and then at me, with an expression that I thought contained something like understanding, not of ventilation systems, but of the particular human preference for returning to the work in front of you. He said, "Can I help?" I said, "Do you know how to reseat a port coupling?" He said, "No." I said, "Then you can hold the tube while I do it." He held the tube. I reseated the coupling. It took 4 minutes, during which we did not speak, and when I closed the panel and stood up, he was looking at me with the expression that had been building through the morning, that recognition, that quality of being seen but quieter now, and without the rawness of the crisis underneath it. As though everything that had happened had settled into something it was possible to simply carry. The way you carry something heavy for long enough that it becomes the normal weight of the thing rather than a burden. He left. I finished the eastern shelves. The formal inquiry arrived 3 days later, delivered to the service staff administrative office, addressed to me by name. It was from Arith Ven, second keeper of the imperial household. 2 pages of formal Althari administrative language, and then 4 lines of plain script at the bottom. The 3rd Kalethi Advanced Medical Corps has been formally recognized for the engagement at Orvith Reach as of year 21. Your individual field certification record has been reinstated in full. A position at the rank of Senior Medical Assessor, Imperial Household, has been created and is offered at your discretion. There is no obligation to accept. The record reinstatement stands regardless. I read it twice. I set it on my cleaning cart. I went back to work. I thought about it for a week, but not about the obvious question, which I had already answered before finishing the letter. The answer was no. I am not, at 44, the person who held that field certification. I am the person who learned from her and kept the parts worth keeping and put down the rest, and what I kept does not require a rank to function. What I thought about was something narrower, that I had been in the Vel Rithani archive for 3 years, and in that time I had been, in the precise meaning of the word, content. The quiet, the cold stone and the warm panels and the shelving that smelled of old folio oil, the 2 librarians who grunted at me at most twice a day, the long table that had not moved since the first Kalethi emperor, the particular satisfaction of a job done thoroughly, without hurry, in a place where no one was watching and no one needed to watch, because the work itself was sufficient. I did not want to give that up in exchange for a rank that would require me to be seen. I wrote back to Arith Ven. I declined the senior medical assessor position. I proposed a counterarrangement, a permanent post in the Vel Rithani archive wing, cleaning staff designation, with an informal secondary role as health monitor for the archive tier, which has genuinely poor ventilation and genuinely cold winters, and is genuinely lacking in people who notice when those things become medically relevant before they become medically urgent. I proposed a modest adjustment to my service grade to reflect the secondary role, and I proposed that the formal record reinstatement be kept in the internal archive, which is to say the actual archive, in the Vel Rithani wing, rather than being published in the way that formal reinstatements are sometimes published. Arith Ven's reply was 3 sentences. The counter-arrangement was accepted in full. The grade adjustment had been applied effective the current month. The record reinstatement had been filed in the internal administrative records, in the section containing the field certifications of the 3rd Calethi Advanced Medical Corps. I know exactly where that section is. I dusted it the following Tuesday. The salute happened on the Thursday of that week, in the corridor outside the archive's main door. Arith Ven was there, and the palace medical officer Arith Velith, and one other person whose presence I had not expected. The senior surviving officer of the Orvith Reach engagement, a man named Veldoreth Selm, who was now the palace's chief archivist for military records and who had, as I gathered from the way Arith Ven introduced him, been working in the administrative tier directly above the Vel Rithani wing for the past 7 years. Neither of us had known the other was in the building. He looked at me for a long moment, his face carrying the specific expression of a person who has spent 7 years above a room without knowing what the room contained, and has recently been told. Then he brought his hand up in the formal salute of the Calethi Advanced Medical Corps, the precise one, the double-finger salute at the brow, right hand, elbow level with the shoulder, and held it. I did not know what to do with my face. I am not generally a person who lacks for composure in unexpected situations. I have spent too much of my adult life in situations that required composure as a functional necessity, and the practice has made it reliable. But 3 years of mopping stone floors, and 4 minutes of field medicine, and a week of thinking carefully about a letter, had not constituted preparation for a man saluting me in a corridor on a Thursday. I stood there for a moment that was longer than was technically graceful, and then I returned the salute. The precise one. First 2 fingers, elbow level, right hand. My hand knew the position before my mind had finished making the decision. Veldoreth Selm said, "Orvith Reach." I said, "Orvith Reach." He said, "I read your counter-proposal to Arith Ven." He shared it with me. A pause. I found it characteristic. "I'm not sure what you mean by that," I said. He said, "You requisitioned an additional length of maintenance tube for the eastern ventilation conduit, along with your acceptance of the counter-arrangement." I said, "The current tube is 17 years old and showing microfractures along the primary bend. I noticed it when I was reseating the coupling. It should have been replaced at least 5 years ago. If it fails in the middle of a hard winter, it will take the air handling down for the entire eastern section for however long it takes facilities to process a replacement order, which based on current facilities' response times I estimate at between 8 and 14 days. He looked at me for a long moment and then he smiled, not the smile of someone completing a formal ceremony, the actual one, the kind that changes the whole face. He said, "The requisition has been approved." I said, "Thank you." He lowered his hand and nodded once to Arith Ven and walked back up the corridor toward the military records tier. Arith Ven watched him go, and then looked at me with the expression of a man who is filing a great deal of information and finding it, on balance, satisfying. He said, "The archive will be glad to have you." Then he too went about his day. I went back inside and finished the western shelves. Sareth Velkethavar returned to the archive 2 weeks after the Thursday of the salute. He was wearing the gray workrobe again, which I found, for reasons I chose not to examine closely, reassuring in the specific way that the familiar and appropriate tends to be reassuring. He came in at 5th bell, set his canvas bag at the far end of the long table, and opened the section of the Rithani primary sequence exactly where he had left off before the cold Thursday. His Sorvith bark tea was in its usual cup. He breathed carefully on the cold morning as he always did, and the faint sound of it was quieter than it had been, and his color was better than it had been, and his hand did not go to his sternum. I was on the northern shelves, which I rotate to on alternating weeks. He did not say anything for the first 20 minutes. Neither did I. This was the way of this room, and the way of the 2 of us in it, and it was unchanged by everything that had happened. Then he said, without looking up from the folio he was working through, "Good morning, Marit Das." "Good morning," I said. I went back to the northern shelves. He went back to the Rithani primary sequence. Old Dorvath Kale arrived at 6th bell and produced his usual greeting, which was a sound somewhere between a word and a clearing of the throat that I had come to understand as approximately equivalent to "good morning," in the particular dialect of a man who has not significantly altered his morning routine in 30 years. The archive panels warmed from dawn spectrum to reading brightness as the morning established itself. The ventilation ran full and clean and quiet through the new maintenance tube that facilities had installed the previous Friday, which ran without the faint vibration the old tube had developed in its final years of service, and which I had already confirmed was properly seated and fully functional. I had 3 more shelves to finish before the midday quiet period. I worked through them without hurrying, in the cold, clean air of a room that was genuinely mine now, not by any formal assignment beyond the service record, not by any grand designation, but in the older and more durable way, by the fact of knowing every shelf of it, every cold square of its floor, every small inadequacy of its 40-year-old systems, and by the willingness to show up before dawn every morning and make it as right as it could be made. I have held that willingness in one form or another since I was 22 years old, in a field that was nothing like this room, wet and loud and specific in ways that this room is not specific, demanding in ways that this room is not demanding, and giving back in its own way, something that this room gives back differently but no less truly. I have held it through things I am not going to write down here, through the years between that field and this archive, through everything those years contained, through the particular discipline of learning to be quiet about what you know, while remaining ready to use it when it matters. On a Velmonth Thursday, in the deepest part of a palace winter, it mattered. I reseated the coupling and finished the shelves. The room stayed warm. That is, when it comes to it, the whole of it. Anything else is just what people say about it afterward, and people have said a good deal. I do not object to what they say. I simply continue to arrive before 4th bell and open the ventilation conduit fully and work through the shelves in order. The archive is quiet in the mornings. The work is slow. No one is watching. That is, and has always been, exactly enough.